Welcome to Security Disruptors. This is an ongoing series of live panels focused on addressing pressing security issues. The security landscape is complex. It involves growing threats to global, economic, political, and national security. Those threats include economic coercion and subversion, electoral interference, lawfare, espionage, cyber attacks, money laundering, illicit finance, transnational crime, terrorism, kinetic war, space war, and interestingly enough, misinformation. The security landscape is vast and the threats keep growing and evolving. The old ways of addressing these interconnected threats are no longer sufficient. Our aim on Security Disruptors is to break down barriers and bring leaders together to foster integrated solutions, to have those discussions that ideas evolve from. Today we start this series by laying the groundwork, looking at what is economic security and why does it matter. Why has the U.S. raised the stakes? What geopolitical and geosocial shifts are underway? And what do you need to know to be prepared for a world of heightened security? Our panel today, William Chou of the Hudson Institute, Jeff Mahon of Strategy Corp, Scott McGregor of Close Hold Intelligence Consulting, and Calvin Chrustie of Critical Risk Team. Now, one last thing, if you're wanting to submit a question to the panel, please go to slido.com and then use the password security, it's a hashtag uppercase S security. You can send in your question and then I will be reading them and we can direct those questions to the panel. But my first question to each of the panelists, which helps us to lay the foundation of what it is that we're out to do with this series, is to establish just exactly what is economic security. William, let me start with you. You have a view of the world with a focus across the Pacific, from Japan in particular. So from your perspective, how do you describe what economic security is?
Sure, Stuart. It's great to be here with you all today to talk about economic security, which is obviously a passion of mine. I think my interpretation of economic security is fairly broad. Essentially, I define it as essentially how do you are able to conduct economic activity using a group of essentially under a system of shared rules and standards without being impacted by non-market disruptions. And so these disruptions can be, there's a lot of different ways to sort of look at it. And you mentioned some of them earlier, right? These include, for instance, influence over sea lanes or transit points, access to critical components and materials within the supply chain, things like politically motivated coercion and use of these economic levers against other countries, subsidies, intellectual property espionage and theft. These are all things that are part of this larger issue of economic security and can shape how countries and corporations and businesses are able to conduct economic activity. And speaking from as someone who studies Asia and especially U.S. Japan and U.S. Indo-Pacific relations, where I think a lot of Asian countries are sort of seeing this issue of economic security, it's really primarily from the perspective of access to key supply chains and key critical minerals and materials. In terms of also in terms of the prospect of, I guess, competition in emerging markets in, say, Southeast Asia and the global South against China, which is obviously pursuing an overproduction strategy. And then finally, the question of, but how do you balance these concerns that they have in terms of their own economic viability against their own dependency on the Chinese market, the appeal of the Chinese market, as well as China as a purveyor for a lot of these critical materials and minerals that they also need to as part of their own economic activity. So this is sort of the conundrum that a lot of Asian countries are sort of facing, and it really requires a concerted effort to address these issues because no country by itself is able to fully address these concerns on economic security.
From the perspective of Japan, just to come back to what you're saying, Is their primary focus in being in alignment with the United States, with an eye of sort of guarding their rear flank in their relationship with China?
So to follow up on that thing, I think look, Japan is a market economy where certainly I think on the Japanese government side, there's a lot of understanding of where the United States is on these sorts of issues. The Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry has published materials that has a sort of a three-part approach to economic security, right? It's founded on the idea of protect, promote, and then partnership. So obviously protect critical IP and industries, promote the development of new technologies that will allow for Japan to be a viable, strong, innovative economy well into the future. And then obviously partner, where means cooperating with the United States and other like-minded countries on shared economic security and say export control measures or cooperation on R&D and key critical technologies. So this is sort of their general approach. I think Japanese businesses are coming around to it, but it is, but for them, a lot of their challenge is the fact that some of them still have a large presence in China, and it's still dependent on uh, part of their own businesses, even though it is shrinking over time as the Chinese economy faces its own challenges and internal competitors are arising against Japanese competitors, right? Especially say in the automotive industry. So I think these are sort of the dynamics that you're really seeing in Japan, where the government I think is much more aligned to the United States, and Japanese businesses are can be a little patchy depending on their exposure to the Chinese market.
Scott, from your perspective, how do you define economic security?
Well, I think I would follow on William's comments and say, security is the foundation of stable commerce. And and right now we're in a pretty volatile state globally when it comes to conflict. And right now, I think we need resilience. And I think the resilience, if we don't find a way to stabilize some of the sea lanes and the choke points in the world that where we have shipping, I think there's going to be some problems arise. I know that the Suez has some issues, Panama has issues right now, and so there's concerns globally around how we can stabilize international trade, mainly through the maritime domain. So I think in my view, economic stability and economic security is critical to commerce in North America, but it's also important to our adversaries. And so right now we're seeing that competition play out. So that's my understanding of kind of how I view what's going on in the world and why security around economic corridors is so important.
You highlight the maritime element of this. I think that for a lot of people,
Mhm.
when they think about border security, they're thinking along landline borders. But it is those pinch points or choke points from a maritime perspective that really are significant challenges, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, Panama is about 6% of global trade in the agriculture, shipping, shipping container type stuff. Um, we see the Straits of Hormuz in the Middle East, which has about 20 to 25% of oil production that's moved through that strait. So these choke points are key to maintaining stability and our economic stability in terms of who's getting what goods on time, um, which causes conflict if things don't arrive on time and contracts are broken. And it hits corporations and business very hard, but it also hits nation states as well.
Yeah. Jeff, from your perspective, how do you define economic security?
So economic security first emerged as a concept in actually development economics, and it was looking at the role of individuals of being able to sustain themselves and have that resilience. Then that's now been expanded out to look more broadly from the national level, from a strategic perspective. And it's really emerged over the past decade or so because of a change in the global balance of power. It's geopolitics is driving this. This tension has brought new focus or attention on the types of policies or threats that can come from the economic domain. So there's probably two broad streams to which I think about economic security. One is economic-based threats to national security, and that's more traditional about dual-use technologies and ensuring economic activities or engagement doesn't undermine national security through the traditional lens of, say, technologies being exported that could have a military application. So we have export controls as a tool to deal with that. We have investment screening mechanisms to prevent investments that could lead to mergers and acquisitions to acquire these strategic technologies. But around 8 years ago, this concept was even further expanded when the Trump administration put out its first national security strategy. And it said for the very first time that economic security is national security, and put this new focus on long-term economic competitiveness and the acknowledgement that certain forms of economic integration could ultimately undermine bigger picture issues, whether it's the hollowing out of the industrial base, which feeds into military production, or even just undermining political and social stability through the loss of jobs.
Do you think that when it comes to the Trump administration and its efforts to try and bring manufacturing back home, because you talked about the hollowing out of those manufacturing capabilities, that so much of that is that it's, yes, we want to bring those jobs home, but we want to make sure that we have the capacity to build whatever we need to protect ourselves?
Absolutely. And this is where the waters can get muddy, because people start thinking, oh, it's free trade versus protectionism. But the reality is there is no major economy in the world that actually runs a true free trade regime. And there's no major economy that actually is in a full-on protectionist mode. It's always existing somewhere on the spectrum. But that geopolitical element's created a certain tension, and it's put a new focus. And we needed a new way of defining these concerns. And this is what I do believe, that a certain portion of the Trump tariffs are actually very much economic security focused, trying to drive back a strategic development in sectors such as automotives and steel, which feed into the military-industrial complex.
Just to come back to you for 1 second there, Jeff, you talked about the tariffs, but they also serve as economic coercion as well.
Absolutely. This is, again, like the old paradigms no longer fit. We need new ways of looking at things, and it's going to be difficult to categorize everything in a clearly coherent manner until we have those paradigms. But when the reality is most major economies, they have trade relationships with various counterparts around the world, and power can feed into those relationships. And when you're that large economy and a smaller economy is dependent on you for trade, there are tools that you can start or levers you can pull to try to force policy alignment. And we saw just yesterday. The Trump administration's tariffs on fentanyl and border crisis has now resulted in new legislation coming from the Carney government to try to deal with those concerns.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Calvin, from your perspective, economic security, what is it and why does it matter?
Thanks, Stu. Lots been covered in terms of the descriptions provided before, so I'll try to be short. Just essentially, it's about power, sovereignty, and stability of Western democracies, from my perspective. That is inclusive and looking at the key aspect of the economy in it. And quite often we used to think of the economy over here and security over here, but I think we're seeing a world where those two have integrated and emerged. And within that economic world that have been primarily focused in terms of profit, finance, financial trends, we're seeing that it's now not only immersed with threats ranging from cyber to illicit finance, to hostile takeovers, to misinformation and disinformation, political interference. We're seeing tariffs being used, economic coercion, subversion. So we're seeing it, immersed and saturated in threats, the economy currently, but we're also seeing it also being weaponized in terms of the economies are being weaponized from one state to another state to extend and project, their political power, control, and dominance of other states. And, nothing new. I think it's, come to the surface in the last, particularly 3 months, but I think it's been very, very always prevalent. But I think, when we look at Western democracies, whether they be European, Asian Pacific, North American, I think we have to look at, CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We've been under attack, through all those hybrid threats that I just mentioned. So there's nothing new here. We're seeing some animosity amongst, some of the allies, which is new. And I think that's probably out of anxiety, fear, and desperation in terms of what's happening around the world more geopolitically. And I think it's just shifted from, the nice term of that we used to sugarcoat it by being competitive to being, part of the larger global conflict that dominates. That includes the kinetic aspect of it and all those illegitimate means of force, exerting force in terms of cyber and those other hybrid threats that I mentioned.
So from your perspective, Calvin, did North America in particular, and maybe even Western European countries, get a little soft because they were wanting to have open markets, live in a democratic society that granted free and full rights to everyone? And did we create a situation that made it far easier for bad actors to be able to set up shop in these different countries and to be able to operate under the cover of laws that protected citizens, but also then protected these bad actors?
Well, I think the warnings have been going on and the indicators have been going on for, decades. And I think we've taken a little bit, from Neville Chamberlain's wish list in terms of hoping that we're going to be able to work through these problems through developing relationships, building trust with some of our adversaries. But it's obvious that our adversaries don't share our values, don't share our morals, and don't share our same interests. And I think now we've reached the tipping point where the hopes of conciliatory working relationships, I think it's very clear. We're seeing it, like I said, through some of those other domains, like the cyber domain, the electoral interference domain, the misinformation, disinformation, and the buildup of the military, that no longer I think we can kind of hope that things are going to resolve and we're going to live in a collegial interaction in terms of the economic world and the national security world. And it's becoming more polarized. And I think that term, global competitiveness probably needs to be parked and accept and embrace that we're in a global conflict situation here, including in the economic domain. And the people on the front lines of it are our business leaders, our law firms, and it's not just the government anymore.
Well, you actually made an interesting point. Within the security environment amongst professionals, they've been raising alarm bells for quite some time. It only just now seems to be reaching the political level. William, what has changed that we're now seeing this start to become a key issue at the political level?
Yeah, I think it's I think a lot of it just to go to Calvin's own comments earlier. I think a lot of it is that both the United States and Western Europe and also East Asia have sort of like assumed that there was a clear division between security and economics, which I think during the Cold War, that was fairly separated. But I mean, even as we celebrated our victory during the Cold War, I mean, didn't mean that other countries stopped competing, right? They certainly saw the economic and also the security realm as clearly very closely tied, right? That's evident in terms of China's own civil military fusion policy, as well as its Made in China 2025 policy. And so I think it's very clear that economics as a sort of both in terms of competition with the West, in terms of their bid to sort of shape global norms and trends, as well as their own political legitimacy within China, right? Where they have a political economy that is based on production, that is based on exports, and using that as a lever to both create pressure on other countries for political reasons or diplomatic reasons, while also shielding China from outside pressure. I think that is sort of how all this is being integrated together. And I think where that has really emerged, I think most prominently in the past 5 years, right? Obviously with the COVID pandemic, where we really did realize how important these supply chains are and how nations will prioritize their own well-being over other countries because and restrict the export or flow of materials and goods to other countries, even though they desperately need them. But I think while in the West we might cite that the COVID was sort of the first sort of sparking off point, other countries such as Japan and South Korea have their own experience of Chinese coercion through limitations of critical minerals exports over geopolitical issues, right, such as disputed islands in the Pacific, or in the case of Korea, the installation of American sort of anti-ballistic missile or like air defense missile batteries that China deemed as somehow threatening to itself, and thus punishing South Korea with critical minerals restrictions. So I think these things are more prominent ever since the COVID pandemic, but I think they've been around for the past 10, 15 years. And I would even argue that China never really stopped using both economics as a weapon as part of its larger security considerations, even back to the end of the Cold War.
Yes, China probably had a much greater focus on that. Now, that doesn't mean that the Americans weren't also using economic coercion as part of some of their efforts on a global basis, but they have turned their attention specifically to North America now, targeting both Mexico and Canada. And Canada has now started to respond. Arav, if you could run the clip, this is just from yesterday, the minister here in Canada introducing or talking about the introduction of Bill C-2.
This morning, I introduced Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act. The bill updates existing laws to bolster our response to national and economic security threats while enhancing the integrity and fairness of our immigration system. Among some of the key changes are new powers for border officers to examine goods destined for export, to prevent the transport of illegal goods, such as stolen vehicles. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies will also have some new tools to stop the flow of fentanyl and its precursors. Of course, there's elements that will strengthen the relationship with the United States. There are a number of elements in the bill that have been irritants for the U.S. So we are addressing some of those issues, but it's not exclusively about the United States. It's also about ensuring that our immigration system, for example, the integrity of our immigration system is strengthened. I fundamentally believe that we have strike the balance that while expanding powers in certain instances does have the safeguards and the protections in place to protect individual freedoms and rights. There is judicial oversight, except in the case of extrinsic circumstances. So if there is an active event happening, including that involves the safety and security of someone, law enforcement can intervene at that point and seek and demand production of information. But in the absence of that, there is a judicial process by which they need to go and seek the warrants and the production orders required for them to continue the investigation. These are some of the very important safeguards that are built in.
Scott, I see you reacting. Your thoughts, your response to the announcement yesterday.
I would never say anything negative. I think any move towards increasing an ability to mitigate threats is good. However, I think there's some underlying things that I've discussed in the past openly, and namely those are the issues that we have in Canada in trying to put people away, which mainly deals with disclosure. We have a couple different rulings that are precedent in Canadian law, which is Stinchcombe and Jordan. I know Cal has spoken about this extensively as well. Without legislative changes and political will, these initiatives fall flat. You can have 10,000 people on the border. But if you can't get them into court and charge them and have them indicted, then all that work and effort is kind of in vain. And that's the issue that we've had for a long time. There's a bit of a bottleneck when it comes to, law enforcement, et cetera, doing their jobs and then not getting the results that we'd like to see in Canada. So to me, it's a political move. I think this has been politicized, and I think it's to appease the public more than it is to actually have effect.
In essence, you're saying, yeah, it's a nice thing to say, but as far as bolstering our security and ensuring our economic security, it comes up short.
Definitely.
Calvin?
I'm going to start on the positive, and the positive, I think it's a good example for NATO countries and others to try their hardest to and strive to maintain the relationship with our former allies, the U.S. in this particular case, and others, even regardless of some of the difficult circumstances and dynamics that are that we're looking at. So I see it as a positive in terms of it's a small step, it's a gesture, but I will also say on the flip side of the coin that small changes, I think the term was to update, was used. And I think to update in 2025, I think it requires radical changes, major changes in terms of policy, legal framework, mind shifts. I think we're, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years behind the threat actors, and it's going to require a lot more than a mere update. And I say that with complete respect and with the intent to support the gesture, but I think a lot more is required, to counter, to counter, what the threat actors are doing: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And really, that's where we have to focus on. And when we talk about balancing things in Western democracies in terms of our legal framework and balancing the rights, we really have to think that the threats are not playing by the same rules we are. And if we think we're going to try to be able to maintain the same playbook and same rules and thresholds, I think we're going to get outflanked, using your term from earlier in the discussion, Stu.
So, Calvin, what would be one of those radical changes? I know that there would have to be many, but what's just one that you would like to see that would be under consideration?
Well, I mean, this one was, the announcement was, focused at transnational organized crime. So just using that as just part of it. And, it's really important because we're talking economic security. Transnational organized crime is one of the threat actors that impacts it, through corruption, through illicit finance, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, Western allies, those within the NATO umbrella should be looking at what are our main threats. And if you go from country X to Y to Z, we're looking at some countries are focused on Balkan threats, other countries are focused on Chinese threats, other countries are focused on Hell's Angels, other countries. We need to go, hey, who is our enemy? Who are the threats? Here's our threats in terms of priorities. So we're all kind of oaring in the same direction. And we're also looking at this, that it's not as if it's just the crime over here, but the business leaders, the legal, the law professionals are all part of it. It's not a spectator sport in terms of transnational organized crime. So everybody's got to be participating in it and supporting the government in terms of some of these policy changes, because I sense that the policy folks are very nervous making significant change because they're going to lose the support of the corporate sector. The corporate sector, if they want to be protected by the policy sector, has to support. And some of those things, in terms of balancing those things, I think the corporate sector, if they really want to be protected, from the cyber, from all these other interconnected, not separate, but interconnected threats, they need to embrace and fully support the governments and the policies of all Western democracies to take a harder stance in terms of these foreign threats, including in this particular case, transnational organized crime.
Jeff, your thoughts, first on the minister's announcement and then what Scott and Calvin have said.
Well, the first thought is I believe that this announcement, this new legislation, is the first card that the Carney government is playing as it seeks to redefine a new economic and security relationship, to use the Prime Minister's words, with the United States. So when these so this is clearly there's a direct line from the tariffs that were put in place, first announced in February and then went into place with some adjustments in March, to this announcement. Because when you look at the executive order that launched those tariffs, it made crystal clear that the path to solving this was to improving cross-border law enforcement collaboration. And ultimately, whether or not this card is enough to be able to have an impact, we've heard from two of our panelists who say it's not, but the ultimate arbiter on that is going to be the U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security, who makes a recommendation to President Trump for decision. And so I think we'll have to wait a little bit to see how that plays out. But how I conceptualize this in terms of fitting in with this whole this rise of this economic security regime is almost like concentric circles. So this is, as I mentioned, these types of policies that the purview. It's not so much geopolitics. We're talking about transnational crime and border issues. So public safety in Canada and the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. So this is the core of a concentric circle where it's focusing on about getting like the domestic national security issues in order. So it's separate from the bigger, broader geopolitical elements, although there's some overlap, of course, as some transnational crime organizations do have a geopolitical angle, particularly as it relates to the fentanyl trade. But I see this as a first step that's oriented towards getting the North American continent in line with the United States view of those threats. And then we'll see more things going out more broader, including, for example, that Golden Dome announcement in recent weeks.
An interesting transition point for us here, that if we look at economic security, we look at national security, but we also have to look at our ability to defend ourselves from a military perspective. And Canada has been called out in particular, but so has by the Trump administration, Denmark/Greenland, because these are direct routes for an attack over the pole. I want to play a clip right now from the Department of Defense last week when they were facing questions from Congress about what the role of NORAD is and Canada's role in that. Arv, can you play that clip, and then let's discuss how important that element of protecting our northern border plays in ensuring that we are protecting economic security in North America.
General Guillot, talk to us about how Canada and the U.S. partner on our air defenses.
Congressman, Canada and the U.S. are part of the only binational command in the world, and NORAD, and have been for almost 70 years. So the air defense, aerospace control, and maritime warning mission are shared between Canada and the United States through NORAD. And so we're integrated at all levels in that mission.
And if Canada were to drop out of that, how would that change our mission in terms of being able to protect our airspace?
Well, sir, the primary way it would be is the northern approaches would be severely under-resourced, and we would lose a significant amount of domain awareness and response in the northern approaches, which is the fastest and the easiest approach for adversaries to take to North America.
We play a critical role. Jeff, I know that I'm going to come back to you right at this moment because I know that this is of a high level of importance to you.
Yeah, and it should be a high level of importance to all Canadians, and it's going to be. I guess we need to just wake up to the fact that Canada is implicated in as hosting a flashpoint in this broader geopolitical struggle. The Canadian Arctic is going to be an area where they're not just from air defense, but also marine, because we are going to see over the next 20 or 30 years the sea ice receding and the Northwest Passage continuing to open up, and there is going to be a lot of activity up there. And so we need to make sure that Canada has the infrastructure in place to be able to handle that, both marine and air defense aspects. And I think when President Trump made his comments about buying Greenland, which get a lot of attention in the media due to the president's personal style, which can be inflammatory at some times. What I really see there is they're sending a signal that the United States, or not, sorry, not the United States, the Canadian Arctic, or the Arctic more generally, is unguarded, and more needs to be done there to shore up continental security.
Well, you mentioned Greenland because other than directly over the pole, another route out of Russia, particularly to North America, is over Greenland, of course. So this is why the U.S. has a focus on that. But William, they also have a focus on the strategic role that Japan would play in being able to guard in any defensive requirement against an attack from eastern Russia.
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of the maritime situation in the Pacific, I think this is an area where there's a lot of room for U.S., Japan, obviously Canadian, Australian cooperation, right? I think the Pacific is an area where I believe my understanding is what, like 70% of the world's trade travels through Southeast Asia. And, China has increasingly demonstrated its own interest in the Arctic despite not being an Arctic nation, China has demonstrated its own interest up there. And certainly they're doing that for a reason. Why they're doing so, I think that's for us to certainly to surmise, but I think we'll also learn more over time. In terms of the Arctic, I think it's important that it's a geopolitically and geoeconomically important region because one, it provides a different, it changes the geometry of the security situation in the Pacific, right? Certainly, everyone's concerned about Chinese actions in Taiwan, possibly in Southeast Asia, disrupting the trade shipping lanes in the Pacific. And American forces, Canadian forces in the Arctic or from the West in the Pacific certainly offer a new geometry that China and Russia and North Korea need to be concerned about. Relatedly, there's also the issue of certainly President Trump has talked a lot about promoting the development of Alaskan LNG. Canada has its own natural gas projects in Western Canada that it plans to ship out the Pacific, and so this becomes a energy security issue for Japan, for South Korea, but also for Southeast Asia, where energy demands are growing by 4% every year. Right, this is a huge opportunity for both the United States and Canada to expand our relationships with these regions in productive win-win ways that satisfy both our needs without having to resort to Chinese dependency. And so underpinning all that is maritime security in the region, both in the Pacific and the Arctic. And I think that's an area where the United States, Japan, and Canada have all talked about greater cooperation, be it in shipbuilding, in icebreakers, and I very much hope that will continue.
Jeff, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on William's points there because this brings us back to this whole notion of economic security that's more than just the traditional military defense aspects. And indeed, a critical element in the North is also just development itself. So I've lived up north in the Canadian Arctic. I worked with the government of Nunavut for several years, and I can say that there is an infrastructure deficit up there. And I note coming out of the First Minister's meeting earlier this week that there is this promise, this signal that there's going to be dual use infrastructure put in place. Because while we need to make sure there's more a larger, stronger military presence in the North, the best way or an equally important way to increase our sovereignty and protection up there is to ensure that we have a sustainable economic footprint, and that means tapping in to northern resources, both on traditional energy, but also in the critical minerals aspect as well, and ensuring also that there's improved living standards for the people of the North and the indigenous or the Inuit in Nunavut, to ensure that they're living on they have living standards comparable to what we do have here in southern Canada or in other Western democracies, as Cal's talked about earlier. So I think it's just absolutely pivotal that when we think about Arctic sovereignty and Arctic security, we also include this notion of economic development and human security in there as well.
So, Scott, just before I come to you, I want to play another clip from that Department of Defense hearing last week where there was a statement made about Panama and the Suez Canal, and you touched on that earlier. Let's play that clip, and then I'll come to you, okay?
I want to assuage some of the fears of my Democrat colleagues that are concerned about the Panama Canal and remind them that in 1956, when Gamal Abdel Nasser seized the Suez Canal, the British and the French got together with the Israelis, and they took that back. And then the only way that was resolved is that there was a UN peacekeeping mission that took over security for the Suez Canal. In 1989, when Manuel Noriega was acting up, we did use military force to seize the Panama Canal in Operation Just Cause. So there is precedent for this because those are the only two strategic canals on the entire planet. And if we need to act in the best interests of the United States, as we have done in the past, or our allies, we shall.
Scott, is that a threat or is it a reality?
I would say that's a definite reality. I'll first start with the talk about the Arctic. I would say that the general's comments were very politicized. Canada's military is about 50 to 60,000 in total, which is about the size of our postal service and about smaller than the New York Police Department. We do not have a replenishment ship in our Navy. Having served 20 years in the military and worked in intelligence as the senior intelligence analyst for the Pacific Coast, I have a pretty good understanding of what the capabilities of Canada are in protecting the country. One example would have been the Chinese balloon that flew over Canada and NORAD shot down. Mainly, NORAD shot it down because Canada doesn't have any planes that can go that high. So we are reliant on continentalism, which is basically the security of the entire continent, which is the United States. Now, economically, if the United States sees that strategic transit point as important to them and vital to controlling trade, but also security, then they're going to act. Make no mistake, if something was to happen to any of they called it strategic choke points, and there are really 5, not just 2. Then there's going to be action, and this is why South China Sea is so critical right now. That is a major transshipment point that benefits the Chinese. I'm sure William can speak to this as well. So when the United States makes those statements, we're seeing right now a consolidation of power. I mentioned the word continentalism. The United States is looking at withdrawing its forces from Europe and consolidating back to the United States. And this is forcing other countries to take up the slack. That move alone shows that the United States is in competition with, the major player, which is China. So that competition, that where they're contesting for natural resources and control of shipping lanes and trade, is creating a lot of conflict. Cal mentioned that some of our allies are up in arms a little bit, but the reality is that this level of conflict is now taking shape. It's impacting everything. It's impacting corporations and nation states. It's redefining how we're going to secure economic or gain economic stability for the West. So what the U.S. administration is doing there is exactly stating what they're going to do should things go awry.
So we are just about out of time right now. I'd like to get closing thoughts from each of you about what you believe are the trends that we really need to be paying attention to corporately, politically, and even individually to help to ensure that we are able to enjoy economic security in North America. Jeff, why don't I start with you?
So I basically believe that we want to understand what's going on today. We need to recognize that this rise of the economic security regime is coming because of these changes in the balance of power and the geopolitical tensions that are driving them. What I am seeing is that there is a struggle for productive investment, jobs, market, and power. And all four of those objects are interacting with each other. My colleagues today talked about choke points in transportation and logistic routes, but there's also choke points in supply chains. And I think businesses need to be looking at where do they have vulnerabilities, or whether it's in market access or supply with the major countries that are changing the way that the chessboard is working right now. And of course, I'm pointing here to both the United States and China, because we've seen both of them are trying to alter the dynamics or change the structure of the global economy so that it suits their interests. And for companies, gone are the days when you could just focus strictly on your business. You now have to factor in these geopolitical wins and how that they can potentially blow your strategies and your operations off course.
Calvin, your closing thoughts.
I think we need a major paradigm shift, culturally, and I speak in terms of NATO countries, Five Eyes and our allies, and that is we still try to package, and I see the gravity, pulling us in different ways in this conversation to go kinetic here, economic security over here, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's really important to understand the front lines of this global conflict have shifted, and it's in the economic sector. And rather than thinking, purely in terms of quarters and profits, we have to think more like our adversaries that are thinking 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and they're thinking in advance. And that supply chain, i.e. the Arctic, is not a kinetic security threat only. It is a supply chain corporate issue that's going to affect everybody in North America and everybody around the world. And we have to start seeing that no longer are business leaders spectators in this. They are actually on the front line. And I'm hoping that we see that shift and we see a more integrated approach between our government, our policy people, and the business community. And right now, I'm not seeing that they really understand that they're actually on the front lines.
Key to that is, of course, raising awareness of the issues so that it becomes front and center. Scott, final thoughts from you, and then William, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I'll be fairly quick here. Business thrives on stability, and stability requires security. Security starts with understanding the threats, and most of those aren't on a balance sheet. So for the corporations that are out there, I'm kind of reiterating what Cal just said, is that these things are intertwined. Having security and stability means that businesses will thrive, and we can only do that when we work together, and having an understanding, and oftentimes acknowledging that we don't know everything, but we want to try to find out. So working with our partners, with other partners in other countries, to try to understand how to move forward. I know Jeff had mentioned that this effort by the Canadian government is helping to try to mend fences, and I think that's the way ahead, is that we really have to come together and find a way through some of this adversity.
And William, your final thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. I think my comments will very much reflect what Scott just said as well. I mean, I think fundamentally, I think businesses often tell me that they're not really interested in geopolitics, but unfortunately, geopolitics are very interested in you. And I think it's important to really understand what are essentially the motivations of the key actors, right? I mean, it is, as Scott said, it is not just about numbers on a balance sheet. It's also understanding, what are the decision makers in Beijing, in Washington, in Moscow? What are their real motivations? What is the kind of worldview that they have, and what are the objectives they're trying to achieve? And so that helps shape, how helps corporations manage risk and understand, exactly where are they exposed, how, what is their sort of short or long-term concerns and things that they should be aware of, and how do they manage, how they deploy their capital or address their intellectual property. All these issues, or also like the flow of their supply chains, all these things need to be sort of integrated into the sort of their internal strategy planning. And I think it's one of those things where we're no longer living in a world where it's purely about efficiency and complete freedom of movement. I think there are a lot of bad actors out there who want to put a stop to that, and it's really more understanding about, okay, how do we plan for this much more spiky and insecure world where a lot of these challenges will persist, and how do we best manage our own expectations and objectives?
Those are good questions, good thoughts to end on. A way in which all viewers who have tuned in and will watch this in the future, questions that they're going to be asking themselves. I want to thank you all for your time today, sharing your insights, valuable insights, and to all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and we will be back in September with our next panel. Thank you.